name is Tom Keatinge. I'm director here at RUSI of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, and together with my co-author on the paper we're going to talk about, Cathy Haenlein, we're delighted to have you join us for this discussion, to launch our paper, Follow the Money, Using Financial Investigation to Combat Wildlife Crime. Just a couple of quick house notes. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if it does go off, please follow. RUSI staff members will take you out of the building, and the prepared remarks will be on the record, and then the Q&A off the record, please. So we're delighted to welcome you all here, but we're particularly delighted to welcome our panellists for this event. So alongside Cathy, who's a research fellow here at RUSI and is the engine of our organised crime and environmental crime work, who will talk about our paper. We're also delighted to be joined by McClarkin, MEP, Chris Batt, and Mary Rice. So Emma was elected to the European Parliament in 2009, and since 2012 has worked on the International Trade Committee at the European Parliament, which I can imagine would be quite an interesting job in this time of Brexit, perhaps, and is currently the lead MEP in the group on trade matters, and uses her committee position to combat and draw attention to IWT, for which we are all very grateful. Chris is the UNODC Regional Advisor for Anti-Money Laundering and the Countering of Financing of Terrorism, based in Vietnam, also covering Laos, Cambodia and Myanmar, where his work includes combating wildlife crime using anti-money laundering and financial investigation techniques. Chris is also the co-author of a recent Asia-Pacific Group on Money Laundering and UNODC report entitled Enhancing the Detection, Investigation and Disruption of Illicit Financial Flows from Wildlife Crime. So we spent a lot of time comparing notes during our respective projects, and has a long experience in UK policing and financial investigation. And finally, Mary is the Executive Director of the Environmental Investigation Agency in the UK and leads EIA's work on the illegal ivory trade, and was also a valuable partner for us on this project. So before I hand over to Cathy, who will begin proceedings by sharing the highlights of our report and the 18 months of work we've done funded by the UK government's IWT Challenge Fund, I'd like to make one important point. So we sit here in London on Whitehall, and it's easy to forget that for those on the front line trying to turn the tide against the criminal, often transnational actors that perpetrate and perpetuate the illegal wildlife trade, tackling this crime is every bit as dangerous as the fight against drugs and weapons smuggling. We lose sight of the fact that wildlife crime is a core element of global organised crime at our peril, as the natural heritage of many countries around the world is decimated for profit. We were starkly reminded less than 1 month ago of the seriousness with which those that profit from this lucrative trade protect their business when Wayne Lotter of PAM's Foundation, known to many in this room, I'm sure, was murdered in Dar es Salaam. Whilst the investigation into his death is ongoing, it seems that he was almost certainly murdered for being highly effective at disrupting this profitable transnational organised crime in Tanzania and beyond. Those that question the importance of committing resources to the effort to combat IWT should be in no doubt of the lengths to which those that seek to profit from this crime will go to protect their business. And so with that in mind, we're grateful to DEFRA for the funding that they've provided to us. So through our work, which will continue in 3 further countries next year to supplement the work we've done so far in Tanzania, Uganda and Kenya, we hope to bolster the efforts of the likes of Wayne and the local communities and law enforcement who dedicate themselves to the fight against the illegal wildlife trade by emphasising through our work the extent to which financial investigation and financial intelligence can be an invaluable tool for disrupting and investigating and prosecuting the perpetrators of the illegal trade in wildlife products. So on that slightly sombre but serious note, I'd like to hand over to Cathy, who will talk through the findings of our paper.
Thanks, Tom. I'm just going to try and be brief because we've got a lot of expertise on the panel and I want to make sure everyone gets a good amount of time to speak. So I'll just very quickly go over the aims of our project, some of the main findings, and very quickly some of the recommendations. So our main focus in this project really was to look at the money flows generated by wildlife crime. We've been struck right from the start by how little is done, to follow those money flows. There's been so little attention and so little focus on following those profits, following the money, the proceeds of the crime. And this is particularly striking when we consider the scale of illegal wildlife trade as we see it today. Traffickers are moving wildlife products for financial gain, for significant financial gain. I think everyone in this room is aware of just the profits that are available from this form of crime. And we therefore embarked on this project in an attempt to pilot a new approach to tackling those flows. So the project really was made up of two parts. The first was a strategic threat and needs assessment, where we conducted over 100 interviews with government agencies, representatives of government agencies, with NGOs, with international organisations in Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda, and indeed further across the global supply chain. And having established the needs that existed within those organisations, we then conducted multi-agency training. And this involved bringing together the range of different agencies, from those concerned with wildlife to those concerned with financial tools. So we had the wildlife agencies, forest agencies, financial intelligence units, asset recovery agencies, anti-corruption commissions, others beyond that. And we got them all together in one room for 8 days during these courses. We also involved the banks for 2 days of those trainings. We had 1 day with the banks alone and another day where we had the banks, the private sector, in together with the public sector to try and look at how they could better collaborate to address the issues. So the main findings, very briefly, these relate to both the current picture when it comes to using financial tools to disrupt wildlife crime and the prospects for using them more effectively in the future. The findings don't paint a particularly pretty picture in relation to what's going on at the moment. In this slide, we can just see some of the questions we don't really know the answers to, given the failure at the moment to use financial investigation tools in many of the affected jurisdictions. We found that despite repeated calls to address the financial dimensions of wildlife crime, for example, in the London, Kasane and Hanoi conferences, the financial elements of wildlife crime are not being addressed. Financial investigation tools are not being used systematically in any of the countries studied. And instead, there's this tendency to stop at the seizure, whether it's ivory or rhino horn. That is treated as a success, and there is very little in the way of efforts made to go beyond that to look at the higher level perpetrators involved. So we can see here parallel financial investigations are rarely undertaken. Financial intelligence units are rarely involved. There was a study done in 2016 by SMLAG, the Eastern and Southern African Anti-Money Laundering Group, which noted that only 2 financial intelligence units in the Eastern Southern African region had ever received wildlife crime-related suspicious transaction reports from the banks. And we also found that of the countries in the region that had conducted national risk assessments, those had not covered wildlife crime. These findings were reinforced when we came to do the training in Kenya and Uganda. In particular, we found that there was a real lack of understanding on the part of wildlife agencies of what a financial intelligence unit is, what it can do, how they can work together with an FIU in the course of their work. In both Kenya and Uganda, there were no formal MOUs between those two agencies. And there was also a lack of awareness, we found, of the fact that you can use other tools, other pieces of legislation to prosecute wildlife traffickers beyond wildlife acts, which can offer much stronger penalties, such as anti-money laundering acts, anti-corruption legislation. So moving on to the prospects for adopting financial investigation tools in the future, we did find that there was actually room for quite a lot of optimism. A promising finding was that there was a huge appetite for these approaches. In all the countries, we found that there was a clear understanding of the need to follow the money, a recognition that this was a gap. This was highlighted by this slide. This was an image that was given to us by one of the participants in the Uganda course, this was one of the suspects he was investigating, a known trafficker. And this is an image he'd been showing off on his Instagram account, just showing, the volumes of money that he'd been earning. And this led to this investigator really wanting to get to grips with those tools to follow the money. There was also enthusiasm in the private sector. This wasn't just about the public sector. Many of the banks expressed they were very keen to start to receive more assistance from both NGOs and the public sector on identifying some of the trends they should be looking out for. Also promising was the fact that following the training, both Kenya and Uganda are now in the process of starting to establish those MOUs between Financial Intelligence Unit and wildlife agencies. Another interesting finding was the role that mobile money agencies can play. It's not just banks that we should be involving, but we had a lot of engagement on the topic of mobile money in East Africa. This is used extensively, especially this is of interest at the lower levels. There's often a criticism that it's difficult to follow the money at the poaching level, where transactions are often made in cash. In the East Africa region, mobile money is often used for these very small amounts and can offer sort of promising avenues for investigation. There are known cases where poachers and traffickers have used these services to transfer funds related to wildlife crime. So recommendations, I'll just go over these very, very quickly. They relate to some of the points I've been making and address different sectors. So we talk about what NGOs can do, what financial institutions can do, what different government agencies can do, and what they can start to do differently to really start to emphasize those financial elements. These recommendations are laid out much more extensively in the report, which will be available after after we finish outside. I think one of the most important things that all of those stakeholders can do is to start to treat wildlife crime as financial crime, and really to start to understand that this is organised transnational crime conducted for a profit. Key to this, I think, is getting the public and private sectors working together more closely, with NGOs lending assistance to this process in a number of ways that we outline in the report. I can't go into all of these, but you can read them for yourselves. Just a few of them are building capacity, pressuring governments to amend legislation where this doesn't allow for wildlife crime as a predicate offence to money laundering, and providing threat and trend analysis to financial institutions. I'll stop there, but happy to go into this further in the Q&A.
Great. Cathy, thank you very much. Emma, your perspective.
Well, thanks, Tom, and my thanks to RUSI for inviting me to take part in this panel today, but also preparing this key paper with the Challenge Fund from the government's IWT. I don't think that when they started it, they knew just how poignant this paper was going to be, and that it has been dedicated to Wayne. Why is it important for politicians? What role can we play in this? And it is always about raising the profile and making sure that tackling illegal wildlife crime and illegal wildlife trade remains a priority at all times. It does often come around and then slips away down the agenda again, and we need to find ways to continue to keep it at the top of the agenda. And this paper goes to highlight yet again another reason why we need to do this, because this is a global problem. It is a transnational criminal organisation and networks that are operating, and that is going through from Africa through Europe and into Asia. And this is the role that we have to play in that role, is that how can we actually help tackle this problem that may not start on our shores but certainly passes through it. And that is something that I've tried to do as an MEP, is to raise the profile of this issue. I requested that we did a report inside the International Trade Committee so they felt that they had some traction with this issue, that they could put it in future trading agreements, that they would have to be looking at anti-corruption in the whole, across the board, in future arrangements. And that is going to be in the new EU-Vietnam trade agreement. And there are clauses and chapters that we can put in there to raise this as a profile in other areas, such as trade, that do always remain a top priority. Again, with environmental, it's beyond environmental crime. It's not just the damage it's doing to the animals, the damage it's doing to our biodiversity. It is also now having a human impact as well. 27 rangers died in East Africa in 2015 alone. It is on a scale now that is really having a devastating impact, and that is having a human cost to it too. So it really is getting to the point where we have to. It is imperative that we take action and we do something now. So what can we do? We need to elevate the severity of the crime, because we all know that this is a low-risk activity, and therefore we need to find ways that we can raise again the issue and the severity of the crime that is being done. And I believe that following it down the road of financial investigation and linking it closely to money laundering and the criminal networks in which it is supporting is the way to go. And I also support the recommendations from the report that follow that road, that link it to a predicate offence, also extending powers to financial investigation units, and looking at the reward side, because it is getting to the people higher up the chain that is going to really make a difference in this fight. And so we really need to take this very seriously. So in many ways we can do this as politicians. We can raise the profile if we have one like the Foreign Secretary, who's always keeping this at the top of his agenda. But there is also the EU action that we need to take, and they have an external action plan now that is working in this area to tackle this. Things that they are highlighting within, not only in the common commercial policy, which is their trading policy in the context of wildlife sustainability, but also looking at trade flows, sharing, cooperation, capacity building, and in sharing the capacity and the knowledge that we have with countries and third partners so that they can feel that they can tackle this alone, and no more than in this area of financial investigation, I think is a specific one. As Cathy also mentioned, the link between public and private sector engagement on this issue and getting that buy-in is enormously important. But of course, always tackling corruption is the main one for us, and making sure that we can find ways to move forward in that, because that will have repercussions for us. Of course, transit is the big thing when it comes to Europe, but we need to get closer to the people that are perpetrating these crimes, and that is getting higher up the chain, which I believe the follow the money approach will absolutely get us closer to. There is so much that I could say on this issue, in which I'm extremely passionate about. The scale of this is now huge. The poaching, for example, in Kenya alone, we're seeing elephants down into tens of thousands when they were in hundreds of thousands. We're seeing rhinos now recorded in hundreds of numbers instead of tens of thousands of numbers. And of course, the human life that, of course, we've already documented. But we have to take something further. We have to take further action and do it now. And I believe that this transnational global approach is the right one. We need to do it. We need to keep that flow of information between us and make sure that we are leading. And that is the role that we can continue to play whilst we're members of the European Union, and after Brexit when we leave, that the UK is seen to be leading in this field, that it is supporting the following of the money approach, and we're doing everything that we can to keep it at the top of the political agenda so that we can help the problem from the ground.
Great, thank you very much. Mary, to you now.
Okay, thanks very much. And I'd just like to say thank you to Tom and Cathy for inviting us to participate today. So, for those of you who don't know the Environmental Investigation Agency, we are a campaigning organisation which investigates, documents and exposes environmental crime or abuse and the illegal international trade in natural resources. For over 2 decades, we've been highlighting best practice and gaps in the global effort to tackle environmental crime, and we've done this through a variety of different media reports, public briefings and confidential briefings. We've also been looking at existing financial mechanisms to see how these could be deployed to tackle the global illegal wildlife trade, and to highlight the potential that financial investigations and punitive measures can have for the effective disruption of the trade. A good example of this relates to a recent case study on the illegal ivory trade. In July this year, EIA released a major report about the role of Shuidong in the international illegal ivory trade. Shuidong is a seafood trading town in southern China, little known. It's still very big, and the traders that we engaged with claimed that it was the destination for as much as 80% of all poached ivory that had been smuggled into China from Africa. EIA first got a lead about the role of the Shuidong traders during our investigations back in 2014 in Tanzania. Our investigators met a sea cucumber trader in Zanzibar who explained how sea cucumber traders from Shuidong had moved to Africa in the 1980s, and how after establishing their legal businesses and building up the necessary local contacts and transportation channels to export seafood back home to China, were then well placed to move into ivory trafficking. The good news is that increased enforcement in Tanzania, largely driven by Wayne, who we've talked about earlier, in Tanzania, has since led to less poaching and illegal trade. But EIA received rumours subsequently that as a consequence of this enforcement action, those involved in the illegal trade in ivory in Tanzania had now moved into Mozambique. So EIA followed the trail of these to the port of Pemba, where they met a group of 3 traffickers whose distinct accents revealed that they came from a specific area in China called Shuidong. It's a very distinct accent. The 3 guys that were involved are, on the left here is a guy called O. He was one of the main investors. He is a second-generation ivory trafficker and had previously been arrested in Tanzania, but had paid his way out with bribes. The middle guy, she, is also a second-generation ivory trader and an East Africa specialist. The guy on the right, Wang, also works with O in West Africa, and he represents a shadowy Hong Kong financer known as Nan. So through engagement with this group, EIA tracked one of their shipments of ivory all the way from Africa to China. And this is Wang showing our investigators part of the shipment in a secure location in Shuidong. This was back in October last year. His intention was to sell this ivory wholesale. And as a regular tactic that these guys employed to avoid customs risk assessment procedures, the paperwork for this consignment was switched midway along its route to make it look as if it had originated in Asia. And the service cost for this was between $1,500 and $3,000 US. So if we look at transnational operations like this, we can see that there are many actors involved. In addition to the petty criminals and the crime facilitators involved in these entities, EIA's investigations have identified players all along the trade chain. But for this report specifically, we identified and focused mainly on 4 of these. And just to note that there can be overlap between the distinct roles, because, for example, one of the coordinators, O, was also an investor with Nan. Okay. I'm not sure where we are with this. Okay. So we can break down the same entities in terms of money. And based on a 3-ton shipment of ivory, of say 3 tons, so that's 3,000 kilograms, a breakdown might look like this. So the poachers might get between $80 and $100 a kilogram. Local collectors will get maybe 200 to 300 kilograms. Customs officers are paid to turn a blind eye. And in Nigeria, for example, the going rate last year was $30 a kilo, whereas in Tanzania in 2014, it was around $70 a kilo. The South Korean freight agent's cut was $450,000. Coordinators like She got a share of $65,000, whereas the investors got a larger cut. And the group EIA identified operates at the wholesale end of the trade, so they have no retail premises, and they sell only to underground buyers at a wholesale rate of about $720 a kilo. The proceeds are then recycled and reinvested into the next shipment. There may be one-off costs as well, such as bribes in the case of this shipment because it got held up in Korea because of a glitch with the paperwork. Financial interventions can take place at any point, but the most common are these ones highlighted here. For example, the silent partner, Nan, never went to Africa and he never touched the products. So financial investigations are key to gathering evidence of any trade-based money laundering interaction between his legal business and the illegal trade in ivory. And without those investigations, only the most visible players in the chain will be identified and intercepted. So you're looking at what we would call low-hanging fruit, the poachers, who are, if one is taken out, another will easily take their place. Payment for the successful delivery of a shipment of ivory is made into an account in China in cash, and following this, international payments are made via wire transfer to an agent in situ, who then disperses the money in local currency to the ivory collector, and from there it's distributed further. Payments are in cycles and schedules, and in the case of poachers, may even be made on mobile platforms, as Cathy has mentioned. So, for example, in Kenya, things like M-Pesa. A sea cucumber trader in Tanzania, this is the sea cucumber guy, stated that during 2013, one Shuidong boss had exported over 10 containers of ivory. He also offered to introduce EIA investigators to his brothers to make an ivory deal. This would have required a down payment of over $1 million. So this was an early hint to us of the level of organisation involved in this trade. And if we extrapolate the wholesale price of 2.16 million per container, one Shuidong boss could sell his 10 containers at over $20 million. So where did that money go? So on the right here is a luxury mansion, also what we would classify as an asset, and it was built in Shuidong by the now retired ivory trafficker, the uncle of the guy called Shi that you saw back in that slide. So the potential for asset seizure from a case like this and other cases could provide real disruption and have a serious impact on the entire trade. And if the illicit wildlife trade is estimated to generate between $7 and $23 billion, then these guys represent only a small component of that. But significant profits means that significant seizure of assets can further inhibit the potential for continued trade and reinvestment in the trade. So EIA continues to focus on this sector, and as part of our ongoing investigations and research, we endeavour to ensure that the results feed into other initiatives working to disrupt the illegal ivory trade. We do this through a number of ways, and that may include providing financial information to the financial sector, by developing typologies, and also by submitting names to a platform that feeds into the Thomson Reuters World Check and Dow Jones risk compliance databases. This helps the financial sector to screen client portfolios and identify potential risks as part of their Know Your Customer initiative. We've given 500 names, and so far 95% of these have generated new profiles within the databases. So this in turn enhances the banking sector's oversight in relation to illegal wildlife trade. And I'm going to stop there before my voice disappears. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. So, Chris, from the other side of the globe, the perspective from Asia.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And thanks to RUSI for inviting me. Fortunately, I happened to be in England on leave, so I didn't fly all the way from Hanoi just for this occasion, although I would have done. As Tom said, I'm with the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime based in Hanoi, covering 4 of the Mekong countries. So I am very much amongst the kind of transit routes and the consumer countries for some of these products. I work very closely with the Financial Action Task Force regional body for that area, the Asia Pacific Group on Money Laundering. And 2 years ago, in 2015, they asked me if I'd be willing to carry out some research into the financial flows from wildlife crime from an Asia Pacific perspective. And in some ways, in many ways actually, the work that I did paralleled the work that Tom and Cathy did, that they've obviously just been referring to. I won't go into the report that the UNODC and the Asia Pacific Group launched. That's not the purpose of this particular discussion, but it's out there, it's been published, and it's there for you to see. What I will do, just for about 30 seconds, is just give you some very interesting statistics which corroborate what Cathy was saying. So we had 45 countries respond in our research. 86% said that they were affected by wildlife crime. 71% agreed that it was a money laundering risk. 79% said, but we don't involve the financial intelligence units. Only 26% conducted financial investigations into wildlife crime. Only 11% of those crimes were prosecuted, and only 1% of wildlife crime was actually the subject of a money laundering prosecution. So those are pretty stark and desperate statistics. And I'm an old policeman, or a policeman of old years, and I remember in the 1980s following the money in relation to drug trafficking cases. And I just can't understand why we're still having this debate. So, the recommendations from the report that I worked on are very similar to those that Cathy's already alluded to. Making sure that countries have the appropriate legislation that recognises that wildlife crime is a serious and organised transnational crime, for example. My sense is that we are actually on the verge of a period of optimism, despite all the gloom. And I see that optimism through something called the Financial Action Task Force. As many of us in this room know, they have 40 recommendations that deal specifically with money laundering and terrorist financing. And recommendation 30 says countries should routinely carry out parallel financial investigations alongside those investigations into predicate crimes. So one of the first things we have to make sure is that wildlife crime is a predicate crime to money laundering. And my experience is that in most jurisdictions that is the case or is becoming the case. The significant thing about the Financial Action Task Force is, as some of you will know, as in 2012 they modified the way in which they carry out country assessments. And now the whole sort of mutual evaluation process is much more heavily focused on effectiveness. And there's also this thing called a national risk assessment. So recommendation 1 of FATF says every country should carry out a national risk assessment to identify where its high-risk areas for money laundering are. Now, I was saying this just a little bit before we started this discussion. The Asia-Pacific group, which is the FATF regional body, have already recognised that in certain countries, such as Vietnam, for example, when they do their national risk assessment, wildlife crime should feature in that risk assessment and be identified as a high-risk area. Only last week, just over a tonne of ivory was seized by Vietnamese customs in Ho Chi Minh's Tan Son Nhat airport. Now that ivory represents a huge value at the consumer end. And how the Vietnamese would say that that is not a high risk for money laundering would certainly raise questions in my mind. So the optimism that I'm talking about is that the Asia-Pacific group, who carry out most of the evaluations of their member countries, are already alive to the fact that when they do their desk research ahead of the on-site visit, they should be looking at their national risk assessment and seeing where wildlife crime features. And if it doesn't feature in a country such as Vietnam, they'll be asking the questions why. Now, if it does feature, the optimism should then continue to grow, because what the assessors will be looking for in their 2 weeks on-site visit is evidence of effectiveness connected to the national risk assessment. So where are those parallel financial investigations into wildlife trafficking if the country's identified that as a high-risk area? Where are the money laundering investigations? So my sense is that countries now approaching their mutual evaluations, and most of the consumer countries are approaching their mutual evaluations over the next 2 to 3 years, are now having to, first of all, carry out their national risk assessment, which, by the way, is generally overseen by the World Bank or the IMF or the Asia Development Bank. So there is an element of oversight. but it is very much an in-country process. But then they're gearing up for their mutual evaluations, and they're going to have to demonstrate evidence of effectiveness. And if they perform badly in their mutual evaluations, then depending on the size of the economy, that's one kind of criteria, the country can be brought back under Financial Action Task Force review, which can lead to public statements and can lead to blacklisting. And I was in Vietnam back in 2013 when they first went on the FATF blacklist, and when people found it impossible to send money overseas because countries overseas were declining transactions because Vietnam was on a Financial Action Task Force blacklist. Overseas investment decreased, and the general reputation of the country took a hit. And I firmly believe that it was those conditions that brought Vietnam to the negotiating table back in 2012-13, when they were first being asked by the FATF to introduce new money laundering legislation in compliance with the standards at that time. So I think when we talk about the lack of action on the ground, the lack of the use of follow the money concepts, the lack of the use of financial intelligence unit, those are all absolutely accurate, valid points. In my research, I found very little evidence of investigators following the money, or in fact doing anything beyond the seizure. There were some good examples. Hong Kong police, for example, Hong Kong customs routinely liaise with banks, the financial sector, where they've had a seizure of ivory or rhino to see how those shipments were paid for, or if the payments hit a particular banking system. But where there is this lack of action on the ground, I am optimistic and hopeful that this next round of mutual evaluations, the national risk assessments, and the need to demonstrate effectiveness will help our battle to combat wildlife trafficking. And with that, I will leave it there.
Great.
And let you open it up
Chris,
to questions.
thank you very much indeed. So we'll turn to Q&A.